This is one of the darkest chapters, ladies and gentlemen, in modern European history. The genocide committed during the Bosnian War is a painful but a necessary act of remembrance. By understanding how such horrors came to pass, we strengthen our resolve to prevent them from happening again. But unfortunately, it does happen again. The Bosnian genocide was not an isolated event. It did not erupt suddenly or without warning. It was the culmination of political manipulation, ethnic nationalism, and a deliberate campaign to destroy an entire people. During the war from 92 to 95, more than 100,000 people were killed, millions displaced, and countless families torn apart. At the heart of this tragedy was the systematic persecution of Bosniak Muslims, acts that the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia, ICTY, and the International Court of Justice formally recognized as genocide. After the Second World War, this is the only instance of recognized genocide in the world. To understand how this could occur in the 20th century, we must begin with the historical background. For decades after the Second World War, Bosnia and Herzegovina existed as a republic within the multinational state of Yugoslavia. Under President Josip Broz Tito, ethnic tensions, though present, were kept largely in check. Bosnia was a unique patchwork of Bosniak Muslims, Orthodox Serbs, and Catholics, Croats living side by side in mixed towns and shared neighborhoods. But after Tito's death in 1980, Yugoslavia began to unravel, as most of us know. Severe economic crisis, competing political ambitions, and the weakening of the federal government created a vacuum. Into this vacuum stepped nationalist leaders. The most prominent was Slobodan Milosevic in Serbia, who championed a vision of a greater Serbia. We also have Modi Sahib, saying things about Akhand Bharat. So there is a similarity here. His rhetoric revived old grievances, fueled ethnic fear, and portrayed Serbs as victims in need of protection. This message spread quickly, igniting tensions across Yugoslavia. When Slovenia and Croatia declared independence in 1991, conflict erupted. Bosnia and Herzegovina, with no ethnic majority and a fragile political balance, became the next target. In March 1992, Bosnia held a referendum for independence. The majority supported it, but most Bosnian Serbs boycotted it. Soon after, Bosnian Serb political and military leaders, with backing from Serbia, launched a coordinated campaign of violence, and thus began the Bosnian War. From its earliest days, the war was marked not simply by military confrontation, by systematic efforts to remove Bosniaks and non-Serbs from territories claimed by Bosnian Serb forces. This policy came to be known as ethnic cleansing, the forced removal, deportation, and in many cases, the killing of civilians because of their identity. The United Nations Human Rights Organizations and later the ICTY documented a pattern of atrocities. The siege of Sarajevo is a very important factor in this. The capital city, Sarajevo, was placed under siege for nearly 4 years, the longest siege in modern history. Civilians were targeted by snipers. Mortar shells fell on markets, hospitals, and schools. Over 11,000 civilians were killed, including more than 1,500 children. The siege demonstrated that civilians were not collateral damage, they were deliberate targets. Recently, you must have heard that Italy is launching an inquiry into allegations. And by the way, they were not allegations because I have seen the areas from where these snipers used to operate. There were a group of rich people from all over Europe. They used to pay money to the Bosnian Serbs, and for that, they used to come on top of Sarajevo, by the way, is in a valley, so it's surrounded by mountains. So they used to come to areas allocated by the Bosnian Serbs, and they used to carry out target practice on the Muslims of Sarajevo, especially children. So they used to do this by paying the Bosnian Serbs. When I first heard of this, I thought this must be some sort of exaggeration, because there were people in Sarajevo telling me that, this is the area where the snipers used to target us and so on and so forth. And I could never imagine that humanity would stoop so low, paying money to target Muslims, like in a zoo or, in a safari. So this is something which does not come from normal human beings. The hatred which was fed to these people against Muslims by their ancestors or whatever, this was one of the reasons all this happened, the atrocities. Journalists discovered various camps such as Umarska, Karatim, Trinopolie, where detainees, primarily Bosniaks and also some Croats, were subjected to torture, starvation, and execution. Images of emaciated prisoners behind barbed wire shocked the world and raised the alarm about mass atrocities underway. Rape was used as a weapon of war, a deliberate tactic to terrorize, humiliate, and demoralize whole communities. Thousands of women and girls were subjected to sexual violence, often in the so-called rape camps, where they were held for months so that they could not abort. And they ensured that the baby was born, and they said, we will change your whole genetics. The ICTY later recognized rape and sexual violence as crime against humanity. The Srebrenica genocide, you must have heard of this. The most horrific chapter of this war unfolded in July 1995 in the small eastern town of Srebrenica. Srebrenica had been declared a UN safe area in 1993, meant to protect Bosniak civilians. But it was inadequately defended, and the peacekeepers were poorly equipped and heavily outnumbered. They also lacked the will to fight the Bosnian Serbs. On 11th July 1995, Bosnian Serb forces under General Ratko Mladic overran the enclave. They allowed them to come in. The Dutch peacekeepers allowed them to come in. In the days that follow, ladies and gentlemen, more than 8,000 Bosniak men and boys were separated from women and children. 8,372 to be precise so far. I say so far because a lot of people are still missing. They were taken to the fields, to the warehouses and schools, and they were executed in mass shootings. Some of the people who were still alive from that era, they said that the Serbs, they kept on firing till the time they got tired. Then they went for a coffee break. Then they came back again, and they again started off killing these Muslim boys and men. Then step further, their bodies were buried in primary mass graves. To conceal the crime, bulldozers later moved remains to other places. The bodies were chopped up and distributed all over the area so that, they couldn't find one body at one place. The victims were scattered all over the landscape. And now what happens is that before the 11th July, every year, these remains are gathered and DNA analysis is carried out. And as far as possible, these remains are then put together in a coffin. And then they are given a proper burial. And that is one of the most depressing sights I've ever seen. Both the ICTY and ICJ concluded that the killings constituted genocide, a deliberate attempt to destroy a part of a national, ethnic, or religious group. There was a warehouse, and we were shown that warehouse. There were still bloodstains on the walls of the warehouse where they used to, shoot the Muslim men and boys. The Srebrenica tragedy is not merely a tragedy of the Bosnian War, it is a warning for the world. The international response to the Bosnian conflict was slow, cautious, and many argued tragically inadequate. For years, the world watched as ethnic cleansing unfolded. Diplomatic efforts failed repeatedly. UN peacekeepers were constrained by weak mandates and political disagreement. Only after the Srebrenica genocide and the shelling of Sarajevo's Markele market, NATO finally intervened with airstrikes against Bosnian Serb forces. This shift in the balance of power set the stage for the Dayton Peace Accord signed in December 1995, which ended the war. Yet the late response remains one of the most troubling aspects of the conflict. The failure to prevent genocide, despite clear warning signs, continues to shape international policy and humanitarian intervention debates. The former president, Haris Salajic, the great leader of Bosnia, he was telling me, he was then the prime minister, that he went around to all the capitals to ask for help. And finally, from Vienna, he got the assistance which was required. And the very next day, the media started showing the atrocities on the television. I remember I was posted in Quetta at that time, and we saw this incident of Markele market, the mortars landing there, and the Serbs created a narrative that this has been done by the Bosnians themselves. How ridiculous can you get? After the war, the ICTY, established in The Hague, undertook the task of prosecuting those responsible for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. The notable verdicts included Radovan Karadzic, Ratko Mladic, the military commander convicted of genocide and crimes against humanity. Numerous other military, political, and police officials were also convicted. While justice has been partial and imperfect, these trials established important legal precedents. They affirmed that those who orchestrate mass atrocities, including heads of states, can be held accountable. Statistics tell only part of the story. Over 100,000 people were killed. Around 2 million people were displaced from their homes. Entire towns were erased. Thousands remain missing even today. Survival was often marked by deep psychological trauma. Behind each number is a family, a dream lost, or a future cut short. Survivors carry scars that no tribunal can heal. While this was being carried out in Srebrenica, the women and children, some of them escaped, and they reached the nearest town, Tuzla. And there we had the Pakistan battalion stationed there at that time. So all these refugees, they converged on Tuzla, and the Pakistan battalion fed them for 3 days because they had no rations, nothing. So they gave all their rations, all their food to these refugees, for which now there is a monument dedicated to this battalion, which, by the way, was Major Raja Aziz Bhatti's battalion also. The Bosnian genocide, ladies and gentlemen, offers lessons, harsh and painful lessons that the world must remember. First of all, genocide begins with words. It starts with nationalism, propaganda, and dehumanization. It begins when leaders convince one group that another is a threat. Warning signs must be acted upon. The world saw the camps, the siege, the expulsions, and yet intervention came too late for thousands. Peace without accountability is fragile. Justice is not only about punishment, it is about recognition, memory, and preventing revisionism. Bosnia was targeted because it represented coexistence. Destroying this coexistence was the strategic aim of the perpetrators. Ladies and gentlemen, remembering the genocide in Bosnia is not only an act of mourning, it is an act of responsibility. We remember the victims so that they are not forgotten. We speak of the horrors so that the truth is not denied. We study the past so that future generations recognize the warning signs. And we reaffirm our commitment to peace, justice, and the dignity of all people. The story of Bosnia is a reminder that genocide can happen not only in some distant century or faraway land, but in modern times at the heart of civilized societies. That is why remembrance is essential, not once a year only on anniversaries, but continually. Let us honor the victims by building a world in which such crimes are truly unthinkable. Let us honor the survivors by insisting on truth, justice, and reconciliation. And let us honor our shared humanity by ensuring that never again is not merely a promise, but a reality. Thank you.